Okay, so let's start talking about chapter 12. And chapter 12 talks about the central nervous system. So when we say central nervous system, what do we mean by the central nervous system? Your brain and the spinal cord. Very good. So now let's start talking about the brain first. So as we have seen already and talked about it before in the lab, that our whole brain has actually how many different parts? Four different parts, right? The largest part is called the what? Cerebral hemisphere or cerebrum, right? And then this is the everything that you see. These are all what? Cerebrum. Underneath the cerebrum or inferior to the cerebrum, what do you have? You have cerebellum, right? And where do you find the diencephalon? You find the diencephalon when you actually do the mid sagittal dissection inside the brain, that you are going to find the diencephalon. And right here, this stem looking structure which is going toward the spinal cord is called the brain stem. And as we know that all of these parts has also many subdivisions, subparts, right? We did talk about all those already. And the brain stem has three main parts: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So now let's talk about how your brain was developed. Before your brain was developed to a adult brain, you had this neural tube. Okay, this neural tube, first of all, they were trying to make this primary brain vesicles. Before I talk about the vesicles, you guys just talked about the vesicles for a little bit. Can you guys tell me what is vesicle? What is vesicle? Yeah, when we say vesicle, like for example, when you did the sheep brain dissection, did you able to like really see the vesicle? Not necessarily, right? But if you are looking at your adult, fresh, healthy brain, inside your brain you have some cavity. Those cavities are filled with the what? Cerebrospinal fluid. Those fluid filled cavities are called ventricles. Okay, so we have four ventricles. When we become adult, we have these four ventricles. So these four ventricles, before it turns into four ventricle, we had this primary brain vesicle during our embryonic development. First one was prosencephalon, which will give rise to your lateral ventricle and the third ventricle, and the mesencephalon will give rise to the cerebral aqueduct, and rhombencephalon fourth ventricle and the central canal. And then during the development you had that secondary brain vesicle, telencephalon and diencephalon, and then the mesencephalon, then the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. So this telencephalon will turn in the adult brain structure your cerebrum, and what is the ventricle they are going to make up? Lateral ventricle. And diencephalon will turn into diencephalon and will become third ventricle. What about your mesencephalon? It will turn into midbrain and cerebral aqueduct. What about the metencephalon? Pons, cerebellum, and the fourth ventricle. Myelencephalon, medulla oblongata, fourth ventricle. And then this is what? Spinal cord, the central canal. Okay, so as you can see, these are the what? Ventricles and the how your brain was actually developed. So now let's talk about the gray and white matter of our brain. So can anybody tell me when we say gray matter and when we say white matter, what is the differences in terms of their composition? We did talk about it before in the lab. What type of neuron gray matter has and what type of neuron white matter has? Myelinated and non-myelinated. Okay. So in the gray matter in your brain, the outer layer is the what? Gray matter. Not necessarily they're gray in color, they're just a little bit darker. And this whitish part is called the what? White matter. The reason they're white matter because they are what? Mostly they have myelinated axon. In the gray matter, they mostly have the cell bodies and short non-myelinated neurons. Okay. So now let's talk about the ventricles. The ventricles are very, very important. The reason ventricles are very, very important is because when you take shower every day, can you wash your brain? No. Do you know who wash your brain? Cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid. So the function of the ventricle is to store, make, and circulate cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. So the fluid fills chambers that are continuous to one another and to central canal of the spinal cord, filled with the cerebrospinal fluid and lined by the ependymal cell. We did talk about the ependymal cell. Who can tell me what is the ependymal cell? Ependymal cells are the what? Neuroglia. These are the what? Neuroglia, right? Present in the central nervous system. This specific ependymal cell, what is the function of this ependymal cell? The function of the ependymal cell is to what? Synthesize, yeah, produce cerebrospinal fluid, store and circulate cerebrospinal fluid. So you have four ventricles in your cerebrum. In your cerebral hemisphere, you have two lateral ventricles. These are two lateral ventricles. That is the part of your cerebral hemisphere. And then you have this third ventricle, which is the part of your diencephalon. And this is right here is the fourth ventricle, which is the part of your what? Your brainstem. Okay. So now, as I told you before, the function of these ventricles are not only to produce cerebrospinal fluid, but also circulate cerebrospinal fluid. So to be able to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid, they should have a passageway, right? From the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle, your cerebrospinal fluid can pass through the what? Interventricular foramen, through the interventricular foramen. From the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, they can pass through the cerebral aqueduct. And from the fourth ventricle, they goes to the what? Central canal. Okay. So that is how your cerebrospinal fluid is circulating through all these ventricles. Now, let's talk about something important. Do you know that your brain is very, very delicate and made up of the neuron? And those neurons are what? Amitotic, non-regenerative. Once you damage it, what is going to happen? Would you be able to regenerate them? No. If you cannot regenerate them, imagine your delicate brain inside the skull. Every time you are doing this, that, or that, they are having friction with the skull and you are damaging your brain. Is it something your creator wanted to do for you? No. Your creator sent you to this world making sure you are not damaging your brain, right? How? How? Exactly like the way when you order something from Amazon, what do? Something delicate, they are gonna place it inside the styrofoam so that they do not have the space to move. Not only that, but also they make sure they are bubble wrapped properly, right? Your creator did the same thing. Your brain inside the skull, that is the box, the skull is the box, and then they are between your what? Your brain and the skull. You have a three layers of the what? Meninges. You have the three layers of the what? Meninges, the membrane of the brain. So those three layers, there are three layers, we call them dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater. As you can see right here, this is your skull. Right underneath the skull, right underneath the skull, you have, so this is right here is your skull, right? So right underneath the skull, you have dura mater, okay? Then you have the arachnoid matter, and then you have the pia mater, which is close to your brain, which is attaching the brain is your what? Pia mater. Dura mater is the one which is attaching the what? Your skull. And in between the dura mater and the pia mater, you have the what? Arachnoid matter. And there are spaces also between this what? Membrane. So you have this arachnoid matter. Arachnoid matter, between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater, you have the space which is called the subarachnoid space, which is filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. And then you have arachnoid space, arachnoid matter and the dura mater. Between that, you have a space called subdural space. It is between the dura and the arachnoid matter. So now, if there is any infection in this meninges or inflammation, we call it meningitis. Inflammation of the meninges, primarily due to the bacterial or viral infection, may spread to the central nervous system, which would lead to the inflammation of the brain, referred to as encephalitis. Okay. And meningitis is usually diagnosed by observing the microbes in a sample of the cerebrospinal fluid obtained via the lumbar puncture. So what are the symptoms? You have the fever, any kind of infection, you usually have the what? Fever, headache, vomiting, stiff neck. Okay, may result in brain damage and death if untreated. Vaccine for most common bacterial strains causing the meningitis. Okay, so make sure you take the vaccine. That's the most important. Okay, so now let's talk about the cerebrospinal fluid. So we know that who makes cerebrospinal fluid, and we know the how cerebrospinal fluid is circulated in your brain. But what is the function? Why do you need that fluid in your brain? First of all, your cerebrospinal fluid is providing the proper cushioning. Okay, proper cushioning of your brain, one way to protect your brain from the damage. And also this is going to give the buoyancy to the central nervous system structure, reduces weight of the brain by 97% by floating it, so it is not crushed under its own weight. So not only that, cerebrospinal fluid protects central nervous system from blows and other trauma, nourishes brain and carries chemical signal composed of watery solution formed from blood plasma, but with less protein and different ion concentration from the plasma. So now let's talk about how you are producing the cerebrospinal fluid. Before I talk about that, let me ask you some question. Do you know that in your body, all the fluid that you are generating are actually coming from where? From the blood, right? For example, every time you urinate, you are filtering that urine from the blood. The sweat, you are filtering that from the blood. Cerebrospinal fluid is also like that. You are filtering it from the blood. So if you are trying to filter that from the blood, how you are taking that cerebrospinal fluid? To do that, what you have to do is, like, you know that in all of over your body you have the what? Blood circulation. So your brain also has the blood circulation. So we know that the blood is coming with all those arteries, right? The oxygenated pure blood is coming with all the what? Arteries. And then arteries to the what? Capillaries. And all those capillaries, the small capillaries, the cluster of capillaries are called the what? Choroid plexus. From that choroid plexus, as you can see right here, the capillaries, the choroid plexus, you have these ventricles lined with this what? Ependymal cell. What is this ependymal cell doing? They're absorbing the cerebrospinal fluid from the choroid plexus. Okay. And then what are they doing? As you can see in the ependymal cell, they have the cilia. What is the function of cilia? To what? To move things along, right? So now after you are filtering the what? Cerebrospinal fluid from the blood, you are circulating with this cilia along the surface of the ventricles. Okay. So now let's talk about normal adult cerebrospinal fluid volume of 150 ml is replaced every 8 hours. So every 8 hours you are replacing it. When we are saying that every 8 hours we replace it, what do we mean by that? It means that, as I am telling you, you cannot take your brain to the shower to take shower. But how you are taking the shower of your brain? With the cerebrospinal fluid. So your cerebrospinal fluid is actually doing the what? Circulation and washing out all the toxin and all the bad things and everything, and then they're taking it to the what? Remember the subarachnoid space. What is the subarachnoid space? In between the, we just talked about it, pia mater and the arachnoid matter. From there, they are giving it to the what? Dural venous sinus, the veins. What is the function of the vein? Vein is the what? They are taking the blood from the different organs and bringing it to the heart, right? So the vein. So they are giving it to the vein. So you are washing it, bringing all the toxin, removing all the toxin, and you are bringing it to the what? Veins. Okay. So now let's talk about that. As you can see, with from the choroid plexus, by using the what? Using the ventricles ependymal cell, you are, first of all, you are what? Synthesizing the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. After you synthesize the cerebrospinal fluid, we know that your cerebrospinal fluid is actually what? Circulating from lateral ventricles to the third ventricles to the fourth ventricle to the central canal, and also from the central canal they can also go to that subarachnoid space. After cleaning and washing and everything, from the subarachnoid space, from the arachnoid matter, you have some arachnoid granulation. They are exposed to the dural venous sinus. Okay. And then after washing, cleaning everything, they are giving all this cerebrospinal fluid back to who? The blood. Okay. In the dural venous sinus, right here, dural venous sinus, by the arachnoid granulation. What if you cannot do that properly? If you cannot flush out all this toxin, if you cannot flush out all this what? Cerebrospinal fluid, what is going to happen? You will have this hydrocephalus, obstruction due to infection, hemorrhage, or tumor blocks cerebrospinal fluid circulation, or drainage, resulting in increased pressure. In newborn, skull bones are unfused, so increased pressure causes head to enlarge. In adults, rigidity of the skull keeps pressure within, potentially leading to the brain damage, can compress blood vessels and crush soft nervous tissue. Okay, very, very fatal. Treatment is to drain cerebrospinal fluid with the ventricular shunt to the abdominal cavity. So now you know that your brain is very, very what? Precious, and you do not want to damage it. So to protect, you have the what? Blood brain barrier, right? So what is the function of the blood brain barrier? Helps maintain the stable environment for the brain and prevent neuron exposure to the harmful substances. Even though through the blood-brain barrier, some drugs, anesthetics, nutrients and alcohol can pass, however, no waste product from the blood can enter through the what? Blood-brain barrier. That is how your blood-brain barrier is protecting your brain. So what are the three important features of the blood-brain barrier? Tight junctions ensure substances pass through, not around the endothelial cells. Feet of the astrocyte and smooth muscle like pericyte surround the endothelial cells, continuous basement membrane. Okay, so what did you learn? What is the rhombencephalon? Rhombencephalon is what? During your primary development, eventually it will turn into what? Your rhombencephalon will eventually turn into what? Brainstem and the fourth ventricle, right? What is the color of the myelin-rich region of the central nervous system? White. Very good. What passageway connects the third and the fourth ventricle? You asked that question, right? Cerebral aqueduct. What function does cerebrospinal fluid serve? Give buoyancy and then cushioning, right? What is the function of the blood-brain barrier? Protection from all the bad things from the blood. However, they can still allow some what? Drugs, nutrients to pass through. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now let's start talking about the largest part of your brain, which is called the cerebral hemisphere. Your cerebral hemisphere form the superior part of the brain, which is the 83% of the brain mass. So your cerebral hemisphere. When we say cerebral hemisphere, what do we mean by that? We are talking about all the different lobes, right? All the different lobes. Okay, so now as you can see that your brain has what? A lot of foldings, right? We talked about it during the lab. The reason they have a lot of foldings so that they can actually increase the surface area to efficiently do all the important function they do, right? So now let's talk about all the different parts of this what? Parts of this fold. The bump of the fold are called what? Gyri and singular gyrus, and the indentations are called what? Sulci or sulcus. If the indentations are very, very deep, they are called fissure. Okay, one of the important fissure is called the longitudinal fissure, which separate your left brain and the right brain. So when you actually did the dissection of your she brain, what did you do? You did the dissection through the longitudinal fissure, right? So there is another fissure right here, which is called the transverse cerebral fissure, which separate your cerebrum from the cerebellum. Okay. Okay. So now as we know that we have these five lobe. So to know the five lobe, I want you to understand the indentation between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. You have this what? Central sulcus. Your central sulcus is dividing frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So you have this frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and then deep to the what? Temporal lobe, you have the what? Insula. Who remembered the function of all of them? What is the function of the frontal lobe? Voluntary movement, decision making, concentration, all this. What about the parietal lobe? General sensory function. And what about the occipital lobe? Your occipital lobe is right posterior to your eyes, so they are associated with the vision. Your temporal lobe on top of your ears are associated with the hearing, right? And smell and hearing. What about your insula? Memory and the taste. Okay, so we already talked about it. For frontal lobe, voluntary motor function, concentration, communication, decision making, planning, and personality. Parietal lobe, all the general sensory, like for example, evaluating shape and the texture of the object. What about the temporal lobe, hearing and the smell? Occipital lobe, vision and the visual memories. Insula, memory and the sense of taste. So now let's talk about the cerebral cortex, upper layer, top layer of your cerebrum, right? Cerebral cortex is executive suite of the brain. First of all, I want you to understand that as you can see the cerebral cortex, whenever you are doing the engaging with the seeing, this part of the brain is what? Light up, right? Hearing, this part, temporal lobe. Seeing, occipital lobe. Speaking, this part right here. Thinking, this part right here. So whenever the brain is actually like very mushy, you saw that, like how does it look? How actually all these neuroscientists were able to find out which part of the brain is what and what do they do. What they all did is trying to understand when you are engaging yourself in the specific function, which part of the brain is actually light up. Okay, so that is how they were able to understand that which part of the brain is associated with the what function. So this cerebral cortex is the site of the conscious mind, awareness, sensory perception, voluntary motor, initiation, communication, memory storage, and understanding. Very thin, only 2 to 4 millimeter, and superficial layer of the gray matter composed of the neuronal cell bodies only. Okay, dendrite, glial cell, blood vessel, but no axon. Okay, so this was a question from them. It is the 40% of the brain mass. It is not the whole cerebrum. This is only the what top layer of the cerebrum, which is the cerebral cortex. 40% of mass of the brain. The whole cerebrum is what? 83%, and only cerebral cortex is the what? 40% of the mass of the brain. So when we think about the cerebral cortex, we need to think about they have the different type of the functional areas. We know that they have the motor areas, sensory areas, association areas. Everyone understand when we say motor areas, what do we mean by the motor areas? The one which helps you with all the voluntary movement. And when we say sensory areas, receiving the signal from the environment. And when we say the association area, like for example, you already had some information in your brain, you were just adding to that. That is your association area. So each hemisphere is concerned with the contralateral side of the body. So what does that mean? It means that your right hemisphere is actually controlling the left part of your body, and left hemisphere is controlling the what? Right part of the body. So lateralization of the cortical function can occur in only one hemisphere. So conscious behavior involves entire cortex in one way or the another. So as you can see, the motor areas is only in front of the central sulcus, this precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex. And then you have the what? Premotor cortex and the frontal eyelid. And then you have this Broca's area right here. So one thing I want to tell you about the Broca's area is, as you know that if you are right-handed, so what does that mean? Your left part of the brain is more dominant, right? And if you are right-handed, left-handed, your right part of the brain is more dominant. So this Broca's area, which is very helpful, which is the part of your language, right? Your speech, understanding, association, all this. So this Broca's area is actually more likely to be what? Present in your dominant area, right? If you are right-handed, most of us are, what does that mean? The Broca's area is present in the left hemisphere. But my daughter is left-handed. What does that mean? Probably hers is present in the right hemisphere. Okay, so now let's talk about the primary motor cortex, which is basically in front of the central sulcus. We call it precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. They have the pyramidal cell, large neurons that allow conscious control of the precise, skilled skeletal muscle movement. This pyramidal tracts, let me tell you one more time, just so that you remember. In the last chapter, we talked about the definition of some specific part of the neuron, right? When we say tract, what do we mean by that? Tract are the axon. Yeah. In the central nervous system, the axons are called tract and the cell bodies are called ganglia. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now large neurons that allow the conscious control of the precise skilled skeletal muscle movement, pyramidal tracts formed from the long axons that project down the spinal cord. Now, before the your primary motor cortex, you have the what? Premotor cortex. Premotor cortex helps plan movement, staging area for the skilled motor activities, controls learned, repetitious, and pattern motor skills, coordinates to simultaneous or sequential action, control voluntary action that depend on the sensory feedback. As I have been talking about the Broca's area, what is the function of the Broca's area? Present in one hemisphere, usually the left, because why? If you are right-handed, that means your left is dominant, so your Broca's area is present in the left. Motor speech area that directs muscles of the speech production, active in planning speech and voluntary motor activities. And also the frontal eyelid controls the voluntary eye movement. So now I want you to understand right here, if you have damage to areas of the primary motor cortex as seen as the stroke. When we say stroke, what is happening during the stroke? We talked about it before, right? Your brain is not getting oxygen for a few seconds and the brain cells are what? Damaged. When the brain cells are damaged, that specific brain cell which is associated with the specific part of the function is not going to be what? Not going to work anymore. Exactly like if you think about this room right here, you have all the lights, you have all the what? Projector and the computer and everything. Nothing is going to work if you do not have the electricity, right? So exactly like that, if your brain cells does not work, what is going to happen? Your body is not going to work as well. So paralysis occur on the opposite side of the body from the damage, and muscle strength or ability to perform discrete individual movement is not impaired, only control over the movement is lost. Example, damage to premotor area controlling the movement of the finger would still allow fingers to move, but voluntary control movement, like for example typing, is not going to happen. Other premotor neurons can be reprogrammed to take over the skill of the damaged neuron. Would require practice just as the initial learning process did. Okay, so now let's talk about the sensory areas. So we have been talking about the motor areas. Now let's talk about the sensory areas. So located in the primary somatosensory cortex located in the postcentral gyrus receives general sensory information from the skin and proprioceptors. Like for example, you are doing a stretch or you are trying to do some exercise. So these are actually what? These signals are received by the receptor. We call them proprioceptors of the skeletal muscle, joints and the tendon, capable of the special discrimination, identification of the body region being stimulated. So your somatosensory association cortex integrate sensory input from the primary somatosensory cortex for understanding of the object, determine size, texture and relationship of parts of the objects being felt. Now let's talk about the visual. Where is your visual? In your occipital lobe, right? Primary visual cortex receives visual information from the retinas and visual association area. So you have specific part of the brain which is associated with the specific part. So one part is probably receiving the signal, another part is actually associating, trying to understand what does that mean, what you are saying, right? Surrounds primary visual cortex uses past visual experiences to interpret visual stimuli, color, form and movement. Example, ability to recognize faces. And what about the primary auditory cortex? Right here, right? You have the primary auditory cortex, superior margin of the temporal lobe, interpret information from inner ear as speech, loudness and location. And what about the auditory association area? Located posterior to primary auditory cortex, stores memories of the sounds and permits perception of the sound stimulus. Vestibular cortex, posterior part of the insula adjacent parietal cortex, responsible for conscious awareness of the balance. What about the olfactory? Olfaction is part of which one? Smell, right? Your temporal, medial aspect of the temporal lobe involved in the conscious awareness of the odor. Now let's talk about something important. This is the part of your insula. In insula, you have the gustatory cortex just deep to the temporal lobe involved in the perception of the taste. We know that your insula is associated with the what? Taste and the memory, right? Now let's talk about something important. Visceral sensory area. Visceral sensory area. When we say visceral sensory area, what do we mean by that? It means that if you can sense anything happening inside your viscera. When we say viscera, what is the meaning of viscera? Organ, right? So what are the organs that you have? Like for example, stomach, bladder. If you want to go to the restroom for peeing, why do you go there? Because this visceral sensory area is understanding or feeling that your bladder is full. So the if anything is happening inside your organ, that is what is actually what sensed by this visceral sensory area. So now if you have damage to the primary visual cortex, result in the functional blindness, right? So now let's talk about it. If you do not have this primary visual cortex what damaged, you can still see it. What if you have the damage in the visual association area? You can probably see things, but you cannot interpret what you can see, right? Okay, so now let's talk about the association area. So first of all, we talked about our motor areas, then we talked about the sensory areas. Now let's talk about the association area. First of all, when we say association area, what do we mean by the association area? Association area is what? You are trying to integrate whatever you have seen or learned or listened before, right? And then you are trying to add the information with that. And based on that, probably also you are trying to take a decision, right? So receive input from the multiple sensory areas, send outputs to the multiple areas, allows us to give meaning to information received, store in memory, tie to previous experience and decide on actions. sensation, thoughts, emotions become conscious and makes us who we are. Broadly divided into three parts: anterior association area, posterior association area, and limbic association area. So you have three association area. What? You have your anterior, posterior, and limbic. Now let's talk about the anterior association area, also called the prefrontal cortex. Most complicated cortical region because involved with the intellect, cognition, recall, and personality. So the way we are different from each other is basically is coming from the prefrontal cortex, right? Contains working memory needed for abstract ideas, judgment, reasoning, persistence, and planning. Development depends on feedback from the social environment. What about the posterior association area? This is the large region in the temporal, parietal, and the occipital lobe, plays role in recognizing patterns, faces, and localizing us in space. Involved in understanding written and spoken language. So can you remember, can you tell me which one is associated with the speech? Which area of your brain is associated with the speech? Broca's area, right? So Broca's area is associated with the speech. There is another area which is called the Wernicke's area, which is associated with the written and the spoken language. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about the limbic association area, that is a part of the limbic system involved in the cingulate gyrus, parahippocampal gyrus, and the hippocampus. I'm sure you have heard of hippocampus a lot. So I'm not sure that you guys know that this is the only part of your brain is scientists can actually start seeing some regeneration there. Okay, so this hippocampus, the way to increase the size of the hippocampus is a lot of exercise and all these things, right? So your hippocampus, so provide emotional impact, like make a scene important to us and help establish memories. So is this limbic system is actually associated with all the emotion. If you can relate any scene, anything with some kind of emotion, you are going to remember that so much. Like for example, if I am telling you that, telling you something, like maybe I'm just trying to insult you, maybe I am saying, Shanita, your prefrontal cortex does not look very like working properly, something like that, something insulting. But you know that I'm not insulting you, I'm just giving you an example. But what if I did that, like really, and then you are like so insulted and sad and really really mad at me, right? I'm sure you would never ever forget that. But right now, you are not taking it that seriously. But that's why probably you're not going to remember it. But you see what I'm trying to tell you. Something which can give you a lot of emotion. It could be happiness, it could be sadness, it could be insult, it could be all these things. We tend to remember those because of this what limbic association area. So if you have the damage to the association area, what will happen? Tumors or other lesions of the anterior association area may cause mental and personality disorder, including loss of the judgment, attentiveness, and inhibitions. So affected individual may be oblivious to social restraints, perhaps becoming careless about the personal appearance or take risk. Different problems arise for individual with lesions in the part of the posterior association area that provide awareness of self in the space. Individual may refuse to wash or dress the side of the body opposite to the lesion because that does not belong to me. Just imagine. Oh my goodness, right? So you are who you are because the brain is working the way it is. Imagine you are probably, it's not your fault, it's your brain's fault, right? Do you understand? Mhm. Yeah. Hmm. My dad also has the stroke, and then part of his body is paralyzed. So I see how he's different now. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not only so we are only thinking about the body function, but what if all the things that we do, like how we talk, how we dress, how we do everything in life, that's actually what, right, coming from your brain. If the brain is not working properly, it's not your fault, right? It's just not working. Okay. So we know about the lateralization already, right? We have two hemisphere, right and the left, and both hemisphere are not same, right? Some hemisphere is dominant to some person, one hemisphere is dominant to some person, another hemisphere could be dominant to another person. So cerebral dominance refers to the hemisphere that is dominant for the language. 90% of the humans have the left sided dominance because you are using your right hand, usually result in the right handedness. In another 10%, roles of the hemisphere are reversed, and left hemisphere control the language, math and logic. So if you are right handed, that means your dominant area is associated with the language, math and logic. You're probably better at that. If you are left handed, your right hemisphere is dominant: visual, special skills, intuition, emotion and artistic and the musical skill. Hemispheres communicate almost instantaneously via fiber tracts and functional integration. Okay. So now let's talk about the white matter tracts. One more time, what is the tract? The axon. Very good. Axon in your central nervous systems are called the tract. So you have different types of the tracts in your brain, responsible for the communication between the cerebral areas and between the cortex and the lower central nervous system. Consist of myelinated fibers bundled into large tracts, classified according to direction they run: association, commissural and projection fiber. So when we say this tract, what I want you to understand, that see, look, the tracts are like this. Okay, so you have tracts over here, right here, this green, this part right here, this one is the what, corpus callosum, right? The green part right here is the what, corpus callosum. Okay. The commissural fibers are there, and these are the what, projection fiber, these are the what, association fiber. So the association fibers are the horizontal running fibers that connect different parts of the same hemisphere. So it's going right to the right, but from the lower part to the upper part, right? So diencephalon to the what, cerebrum. And then commissural fiber, horizontal fiber that connect gray matter of the two hemisphere. So these are between the two hemisphere, right and the left, which is the what, corpus callosum. And then projection fiber, vertical fibers that connect the hemispheres with the lower brain or the spinal cord. Now let's talk about, somebody told me that the cell bodies in the central nervous system is called ganglia. Is it true? Not true. They are called nuclei in the central nervous system. They are called ganglia in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. So now let's talk about the nuclei. When we say nuclei, we are talking about the cell bodies in the central nervous system. So the gray matter deep in the cerebrum that helps regulate the motor output. Each hemisphere's basal nuclei include a caudate nucleus, pattern and the rhythm of the walking. And then you have the putamen, movement of at a subconscious level. And when we say movement at a subconscious level, what do you mean by that? You are not probably thinking about where you are walking, just walking like that, right? And globus pallidus, caudate nucleus and putamen together, striatum. So what is the function of the basal nuclei? Influence muscle movement, regulate intensity of the slow or stereotype movement, filter out incorrect and inappropriate responses, inhibit antagonistic and unnecessary movement. Now, if you have a disease called Huntington disease, due to the Huntington disease, you will have a mutated Huntington protein, which is toxic to the neurons. Due to the toxicity of that Huntington protein to the neuron, you will have the rapid, jerky, involuntary movement, intellectual deterioration, fatal within 10 to 20 years after onset. There is another disease called the Parkinson's disease, affects muscle movement and the balance, stiff posture, slow voluntary movement, resting tremor, caused by deceased dopamine production and death of neuron in substantia nigra. Okay, so what did you learn so far? Typically, which cerebral hemisphere is specialized for language function? Left. Yeah, very good. What is the location and the function of the premotor cortex? It is the part of the what? Frontal lobe. But what is the function? In which lobe is the primary auditory cortex located? Auditory cortex located, temporal lobe, right? Okay, what is the putamen and what function does it serve? I just talked about it, right? Putamen right here, movement at the subconscious level. Okay, so now let's come to diencephalon. Have you all seen this diencephalon last week? Yeah. Okay, when you do the dissection, you are going to see the diencephalon. What are the parts of diencephalon? You have epithalamus, hypothalamus, thalamus, right? Provides relays and switching centers for sensory, motor, and visceral pathways. So this part right here is called the what? Corpus callosum. This part right here is called the septum pellucidum, that you have been asking. Septum pellucidum separate the two lateral ventricles, right? And then you have the what? Thalamus to the front. Underneath the thalamus you have the hypothalamus, which is associated with all this what? Pituitary gland, which is a very important gland, right? And then at the back, toward the back, a little bit above, you have this what? Epithalamus. And epithalamus houses the what? Pineal gland. What is the function of pineal gland? To secrete melatonin. What is the function of melatonin? Regulate the sleep awake cycle, right? The reason you feel sleepy in the class is because you are probably producing more melatonin, right? Okay. So now, because my lecture seems like lullaby, right? Help you secrete more melatonin. Okay, so as you can see, your hypothalamus, thalamus, epithalamus right here, right? Okay, so now let's talk about the function. Epithalamus, most dorsal portion of the diencephalon, forms roof of the third ventricle, contain the pineal gland, extend from posterior border, secrete melatonin that helps regulate the sleep awake cycle. What about the thalamus? Main thalamic function is to act as a relay station for information coming into the cortex, sorts, edits, and relays ascending input. Overall, it acts to mediate sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory, filters background noise in the crowded room, right? Like, for example, even if you think about this room, in addition to my voice, there are other noise. I don't know if you can hear it, but you are not focusing on that because your thalamus is helping you to filter out what is important to you. Okay. So now let's talk about the hypothalamus. Very important part because it regulates the homeostasis. Like everything which is going wrong in your body is trying to make sure that you are getting back to the what? Normal, right? So to do that, your hypothalamus has to work so hard. Regulate body temperature, regulate hunger and thirst, sleep awake cycle. Controls autonomic nervous system, blood pressure, rate and force of the heartbeat, digestive tract, motility, pupil size. Initiate physical responses to emotion. Part of limbic system, perceive pleasure, fear, rage, biological rhythm, and sex drive. Okay, so now let's go and talk about the brain stem. When we say brain stem, what are the different parts of the brain stem? So in the brain stem right here, this is called the what? Medulla oblongata, the pons, which is also called the bridge right here. And then you have this corpora quadrigemina. In the corpora quadrigemina right here, this corpora quadrigemina together is making the what? Midbrain, right? Okay. So now let's start talking about the different parts of the brain stem. Control autonomy, automatic behavior necessary for survival, connects cerebrum, diencephalon, and cerebellum to the spinal cord. And midbrain relay center for the visual and the auditory. And then midbrain nuclei scattered throughout the white matter include corpora quadrigemina, and corpora quadrigemina has the two protrusions coming out. One is called the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Superior colliculi associated with the visual reflex centers, and your inferior colliculi associated with the auditory relay center. And there is the substantia nigra functionally linked to the basal nuclei. Then the pons, which is the bridge, the meaning of the pons is bridge located between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata, connects higher brain center and the spinal cord, your higher brain center and the spinal cord. And then the medulla oblongata, many functions overlap with the hypothalamus. Rate and depth of breathing, force and rate of heart contraction and cardiac output, blood vessel diameter and blood pressure, regulate vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, all these reflexes, right? And what about the cerebellum? Cerebellum, do you remember about this tree-like structure? What do we call this tree-like structure when you do the dissection of the cerebellum? Arbor vitae, right? Arbor vitae. So the cerebellar hemisphere connected by the worm-like vermis and processes input from cortex, brainstem, and sensory receptor to provide precise, coordinated movement of the skeletal muscle. Also play a major role in balance. Now let's talk about the limbic system, which is associated with the emotion, right? In your limbic system, you have the cingulate gyrus, expressing emotion via gesture, resolves mental conflict. Hippocampus help form long-term memories, and there is the amygdaloid body, involved in many aspects of the emotion and emotional memory, especially fear, extreme happiness, or sadness. When after giving birth, actually the mother's amygdala becomes like really, really large, and they become really, really alert. Okay. Olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, and olfactory cortex process odors that can provoke emotion. Olfaction, smell. Okay. So now let's talk about the reticular formation. Send impulses to cerebral cortex to keep it conscious and alert. Like that is why when you are sleeping, when the alarm clock rings, you can actually wake up and turn it off because of the reticular. Even though you are sleeping, but your reticular what formation can help you keep it conscious and alert, and even when you are not what properly conscious. So filters out repetitive, familiar, or weak stimuli relate to consciousness. Inhibited by the sleep center, alcohol, or drug, severe injury can result in permanent unconsciousness. Okay. So what did you learn so far? What are the three divisions of the diencephalon? Thalamus, epithalamus, hypothalamus. What regulate the circadian rhythm? Melatonin, right? What are the three regions of the brain stem? Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. What are the functions of the medulla oblongata? All the reflexes, right? Hiccuping, swallowing, vomiting. What is the main function of the cerebellum? Balance. Balance is the main function of the cerebellum. Now let's talk about the higher mental function. When we say higher mental function, what are the higher mental function? Your language, how many language you can speak, right? Memory, how much memory you can keep, brainwave and EEGs, consciousness, sleep and sleep awake cycles. Let's talk about the language. We know already that which part of your brain is associated with the language. Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. So you have the Broca's area involved in the speech production. Patient with the lesion in Broca's area understand the word but cannot speak. When we say the Wernicke's area involved in understanding the spoken and the written words, understanding. So you might be able to see it, you cannot be able to understand it if you have a damage in the Wernicke's area. So corresponding areas on the right side are involved with the nonverbal language components. So what do we mean by that? So we know that you have Broca's area only in one hemisphere. What about the other hemisphere? Other hemisphere you did not have the Broca's area. But that part is probably not associated with the speech production. However, it can still help you with the what? Non-verbal language component, which is not probably someone is speaking, but with the gesture, with all these things. Does it make sense? Okay, so now let's talk about the memory, storage and the retrieval of the information. Can you hear something and tell me right after? Can you do that? Right? So that is your memory. Different kind of memory that you can have. Declarative memory, name, faces, word, dates. I had it very good when I was little, young, right? I used to I used to remember, if you tell me a 10-digit number, I can tell you right after. I can like literally memorize it. But now I cannot do that anymore, but I used to. Then the procedural memory of the skill, like for example, you're playing the piano, procedure, right? Riding bicycle is your motor memory, because this is still a procedure, but you have to involve your motor function, right? Your motor memory is what? Riding a bike. But procedure, playing a piano. Emotional memory of the experience linked to an emotion, heart pounding when you hear the rattlesnake, right? Or maybe someone chasing you, or maybe um, anything that can evoke a lot of emotional um, responses. You are gonna remember it. Memory consolidation involves fitting new facts into the categories already stored in the cerebral cortex, right? So this is important. The most important part is the memory consolidation. So you can have different type of the memory. You can have short term memory, you can have long term memory. So you can have short term memory. For example, every time you are trying to log in, you have to look at the passcode, right? You have to look at that code that send you, right? You have to remember it for short time, just so that you look at it and type it, right? And then you forget, don't worry about it, right? But now let's talk about the long-term memory. Long-term memory is something probably this, whatever information you are learning right now, you want to remember that probably at least until the exam, right? So now this is not that easy. You look at it and you use it and you forget it. It's not like that. You have to, what do you have to do? You have to do so many things. You have to repeat. You have to remember, recall. You have to go back. You have to do so many different things so that you can actually consolidate that memory, right? Okay. So now if you have damage to the hippocampus or surrounding temporal lobe structure on either side, your hippocampus is associated with the memory, right? If you have damage to the hippocampus, what is going to happen? Bilateral destruction causes the widespread amnesia. So you can have two types of the amnesia, retrograde and anterograde. When we say retrograde, what do we mean by that? It means that you are probably forgetting the memories from the past. And anterograde mean was you already have the memory from the past, but you cannot memorize anything in future anymore, right? That is called the Anterograde amnesia. Person lives in the here and now. They are not remembering anything. They are the best person in the world, right? You slap them, right? The day after, they're gonna come and be nice to you, right? Okay. Okay. Now let's talk about the Alzheimer disease. Okay. So Alzheimer disease, progressive degenerative disease of the brain that result in dementia, memory loss, short attention span, disorientation, eventual language loss, irritability, moodiness, confusion, hallucinations. Why does that happen? Due to the beta amyloid plaques, peptides found in the brain, and no neurofibrillary tangles inside neuron interfere with the transport mechanism, eventually killing the neuron. As brain cells die, brain shrink. Okay. So now let's talk about the brain wave pattern. Have you ever heard of all these different brain wave pattern, alpha, beta, gamma, delta? When you are trying to probably learn meditation, you are gonna probably start learning about all these different type of the wave. Okay. So we are going through all these waves. Like what about the alpha wave? So this is the regular and rhythmic low amplitude synchronous wave indicating an idling brain. When we say idling brain, what does that mean? You are not very alert, right? You are just like maybe relaxing, right? You are not trying to learn anything. You are not trying to do something important, right? That is the alpha wave. So what about the beta wave? Whenever you have the beta wave, probably you are trying to, at this period right now, you are supposed to have your beta wave working, but probably some of you already started having the alpha wave. That is why you were like, okay. So if you are at alpha wave, you are not probably consolidating any memory at this point. But if you are at beta wave, you are probably what? Started learning something, right? And then you have the theta wave, more irregular, common in children, uncommon in awake adults. What about the delta wave? High amplitude wave of the deep sleep when reticular activating system is suppressed as during anesthesia, indicate brain damage is in awake adult. Okay. So let me tell you, let me ask you one more time. Theta wave, do you see that in the adult? No, it is common in the children. What about your delta wave? During the deep sleep. What is the alert wave? Beta. What is the relaxing wave? Alpha. Relaxing is alpha. Alert, beta. Gamma is not even common in adult, only in children. What about the delta? During the deep sleep. Okay. So now, have you ever heard of the epilepsy, epileptic seizure, torrent of the electrical discharge by group of neuron, prevent any other messages from getting through. Victim of epilepsy may lose consciousness, fall stiffy, and and have uncontrollable jerking. Have you ever seen seizure? No? Yeah. Epilepsy is not associated with the intellectual impairment. Epilepsy occurs in 1% of the population. Genetic factors play a role, but brain injury, stroke, infection, and tumors can also be causes. So, aura or sensory hallucination may precede a seizure. Absent seizure, mild seizure of the young children, expression goes blank for few seconds. Tonic-clonic seizure, most severe, last few minutes, victim loses consciousness, bones broken during intense convulsions, loss of bowel and bladder control, and severe biting of the tongue. Okay. Very sad. Okay. So now let's talk about the sleep awake cycle. So what's happening in the sleep awake cycle? So in the awake, then you have the REM, non-REM, stage 1, non-REM stage 2, non-REM stage 3, and the non-REM stage 4. So what's happening in the awake? You can see you are alert and everything, and then the REM skeletal muscle started to what? Relax are actively inhibited, mostly dreaming occurs. And then stage 1, non-REM stage 1, relaxation begin, and EEG shows alpha wave, arousal is easy. And then non-REM stage 2, so if you are at the sleep stage like 1, it is easy to wake up, right? What happens during the stage 2? Irregular EEG with the sleep spindles, arousal is more difficult. And stage 3, sleep deepens, theta and alpha, delta waves appear, vital signs decline. What about the stage 4? EEG is dominated by the delta waves, arousal is difficult, bed wetting, night terrors, and sleepwalking may occur. So the types of sleep, we pass through first two stage of non-REM during the first 30 to 45 minutes of the sleep, then move into the stage 3 and 4 referred to as slow wave sleep. At 90 minutes in, fourth stage ends and REM sleep begins abruptly. Temporary paralysis except for rapid eye movement. Oxygen consumption, heart rate, breathing increase and increase can be like greater than when awake. And most dreaming occurs in the REM stage. So awake, dreaming occurs in the REM stage. Stage 1 is what? Easy to wake up. Stage 2 is your sleep is getting what? More deep. And 3 and 4, slow wave sleep. Okay, so now let's talk about the stroke. I did talk about it for few times. Can you guys tell me what is the stroke? No oxygen supply to for a few seconds can actually damage your what? Brain, right? So ischemia, tissue deprived of the blood supply. If you do not have the blood supply, what happens? No oxygen supply. Leading to death of the brain tissue can be caused by the blockage of the cerebral artery by the blood clot. Glutamate acts as excitotoxin, worsening the condition. Hemiplegia, paralysis on one side or sensory and speech deficit may result. Transient ischemic attack, temporary episode of the reversible cerebral ischemia, and tissue plasminogen activator is only approved treatment for the stroke. Now let's talk about the if your central nervous system is working properly or not properly, how can you test that? To be able to test that, you can include knee jerk reflex. Have you ever heard of that? Knee jerk reflex, you just tap it on your patella and then right away you do the extension, right? That is your what? Knee jerk reflex. That is a very fast reflex because there is no interneuron between. Okay, that is called the knee jerk reflex. Simple test can include knee jerk reflex with hammer tapped against the quadriceps tendon. Abnormal response may indicate intracranial hemorrhage, multiple sclerosis, or hydrocephalus. So if you cannot provide the proper what reflex, what does that mean? It means that you might have all these diseases. So CT scan, MRI scan, PET scan allow for quick identification of the tumor, lesions, plaque, or areas of the infarct. Radioactive tracers help visualize specific areas. Cerebral angiographic uses X-rays with dye to pinpoint any stroke causing clot. Ultrasound can be used to evaluate blood flow through arteries feeding the brain. Okay, what are the two main areas of the brain involved with the language? Broca's area, Wernicke's area. What helps promote long-term memory storage? Consolidation, yeah. Which brain waves are most commonly seen during the sleep? Delta wave, yeah. Alpha wave is just idle, relaxing. Sleep, delta wave, and gamma is the what? Not, and then beta, alert, right? Okay, now let's talk about the cranial nerves. How many cranial nerves do we have? 12. When we say cranial nerve, what do we mean by that? The nerves that are coming out of your brain are called the what? cranial nerves, and we have what? 12 pairs of the cranial nerves. As you can see, the cranial nerves, they have the specific location and all of them in pair, right? First one is your what? Olfactory, then optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, vagus, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, and then what do you have? Accessory and hypoglossal. So what do you have to actually know? You have to know their location, you have to know their name, you also have to know their what? Number. So number 1 in Roman number, olfactory. Number 2, optic, Roman number. Oculomotor, Roman number. Trochlear, 4, right? So you have to know their number, you have to know their name, you have to know their location, also you have to know their function. So now these mnemonics right here will help you to remember some of these things. So olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. So you have to know their name. This is also going to tell you the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay. This is also going to tell you the location too, because if you know the number, you also know the location, because the location is what? One after another, right? You also have to know their function. For example, your olfactory helps with the olfaction. Olfaction is what? Smell. Optic, optic is what? Vision, right? Oculomotor, eye movement, right? So what I'm trying to tell you right here, this is the specific function. You also have to know their basic function. Like for example, olfactory is what? Olfaction, smell. Smell is what? Sensory. So sensory. So this is the mnemonic that you have to know. What is the mnemonic? Some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter more. Okay, so your olfactory is what? Sensory. Optic, sensory. Oculomotor, motor. Trochlear, motor. Trigeminal, both sensory and the motor. Abducens, motor. Facial, both. And then vestibulocochlear, sensory, hearing, right? And then you have the what? Glossopharyngeal, both. Vagus, both. Accessory, motor. Hypoglossal, motor. Does it make sense? So I am not going over each slide talking about their function. What I want you to do is go over this as a group, make two groups. So we have right and the left group. Left group is going to ask question about the first 6 pairs. You are going to ask question about the next 6 pairs. Okay, you are gonna go over that as a group and ask each other question as a what? As a what? Your bonus questions. These are the bonus points activity. Okay, whoever is going to win is going to get 10 bonus points today. Okay, so now let's do that. So basically you have to memorize and remember this whole chart right here. Okay, so that's all you have to learn and know.